Good afternoon, everyone, again. This is Ami Faria. I cover neuroscience and targeted oncology here at Needham. It's my pleasure to be hosting NRx Pharmaceuticals for the next session here. Just as a reminder to all the listeners, if you have any questions that you'd like me to ask the management team, feel free to send it over to me through the chat session. With that, I wanted to thank Robert and team for taking the time to do this today. And Robert, please kick it off with the presentation, and we'll have some time at the end for Q&A.
Thank you, Ami. It's my pleasure to be here today. My name is Robert Besthof. I'm the interim CEO of NRx. And with me today are Randy Guggenheimer, our Chief Business Officer, and Ira Strasberg, our CFO. Let me give a little bit of the usual disclaimers. We will be talking about forward-looking statements. Please make sure you observe those. The company was founded in late 2015, early 2016 by the brothers Dr. Jonathan Javid and Daniel Javid in the pursuit of a drug to inhibit the impulse of suicide in bipolar depression. Our company now has two late-stage assets, one in psychiatry and one in respiratory, and they both have significant revenue potential. What is exciting is that we're focusing on areas of very high unmet need with compounds that have been well studied and understood, and for which we have established an exclusivity or intellectual property position. NRx 101, which is the cornerstone of the company, is targeted at bipolar depression with acute suicidality and subacute suicidality. We have breakthrough therapy designation and a SPA for the indication of bipolar depression with acute suicidal ideation and behavior. And what is exciting about our compound is that it is the first one in the area of NMDA that has a patented composition of matter patent. And we have a phase 3 registration study that is going to be starting later in the year. And we only need about 150 patients to make it to an NDA. We are also recently started a phase 2 study in the subacute bipolar depressed population. On the right side, we have our respiratory franchise with ZYESAMI, aviptadil, which is our proprietary formulation for vasoactive intestinal peptide. And it's an intravenous form that in the first indication, we've targeted towards critical COVID-19. We completed our phase 2b3 study, and we recently announced that we had resubmitted for EUA in February. Additionally, NIH is running a phase 3 study that is currently at about 465 patients out of the 640. That study is fully funded by the NIH. All we contribute is the drug. We have also, in this time, enabled commercial supply for our drugs. So what is exciting is you have two franchises that have potential not only in the indications that I talked, but multiple other applications as well, and that have potential to contribute revenue in 2023 and 2024. With me today are Randy and Ira. Let me briefly talk about our leadership team. Randy has more than 25 years of experience in investment banking in the healthcare sector. Rick Panacucci, who leads our technical operations, has been doing this also for a very long time. Ira, who has been in multiple leadership functions of the finance area, including public companies, and his last position being CFO, deputy CFO, I should say, of Cantor Fitzgerald. Alessandra Daniel, who is our general counsel and chief corporate counsel, and then Molly Kogan, who is a senior director. You see, our leadership team comes from a broad background, and we're very forward-leaning, very hands-on, which is a key corporate tenet for us in order to lead to execution. Also on the board, we have a very distinguished and experienced board with a broad background on health policy, biosecurity, and drug development, including our founder, Dr. Jonathan Javid, as well as other members of our board, including General H.R. McMaster. Let me talk about our pipeline. So I mentioned before, we have two areas, one in psychiatry and one in respiratory. In the area of psychiatry, we have NRx 101 and NRx 100. So NRx 100 is ketamine, which is the infusion that we use to stabilize patients that are acutely suicidal. And NRx-101 is the drug that we're pursuing for severe bipolar depression in patients with acute suicidal ideation and behavior, for which the FDA gave us breakthrough therapy designation and a SPA. We completed a phase 2 study in that area, and we will be starting our phase 3 registrational study with commercial supply in the second half of this year. We have recently announced that we started a study in phase 2 for patients that have bipolar depression with subacute suicidal ideation and behavior, which is a status where they don't need to be hospitalized. In the respiratory franchise, we have ZYESAMI, and we've completed our phase 2b/3 study of intravenous ZYESAMI in critical COVID-19. Now, additionally, NIH is running a phase 3 study, and I mentioned before, it is approximately at 465 patients out of 640, and we expect data by the end of the year. We have recently paused our inhaled study, and we'll be evaluating path forward for that as we concentrate right now on the IV form of ZYESAMI. So let me talk about NRx-101 and why we're so excited about restarting our psychiatry work. Suicidal bipolar depression is an area of very, very high unmet need. If you know 2 individuals with bipolar disorder, one of them is likely to commit suicide or attempt suicide over their lifetime. If you know 5, one of them is likely to succeed. It is that staggering of a number. And then the US, the estimate is that between 2.4 and 4.4% of the population, adult population, have bipolar disorder. So it is a very high unmet need. We call it a large need by us focusing on bipolar depression with acute suicidality. So why do we think NRx offers such a differentiated profile? And we have an agreed upon path with the FDA. We know now that MMDA is a validated mechanism both for depression and suicidality. And think of depression and suicidality as anxiety and depression. They go hand in hand, but they're not one and the same. And what we do know is that NMDA receptor antagonists such as ketamine modulate both depression and suicidality. There is data from esketamine and including data from our NRx-101 phase 2 study, which I'll be sharing with you shortly. It addresses a very high unmet need. Treating depression with acute suicidality is a very high unmet need, in particular with an oral and non-addictive drug. Recall that in this particular population, in the bipolar population, addiction is an area of great concern. We do have composition of matter patents, so we have a solid intellectual property position, and we have an agreed upon regulatory path with the FDA by having a special protocol agreement as well as breakthrough therapy designation. So what we will be doing is really replicating what we've done in phase 2. And in order to do that, we need a little bit less than 150 patients to make it to an NDA. So we have a potential path to filing in 2023. What is the NRx discovery? Why did we get an intellectual property position? So the NRx discovery is the simultaneous blockade of NMDA antagonist and 5-HT2A. This is what Dan Javid, who is a professor of neuropsychopharmacology, also at Columbia University, discovered. And this is what we license, and this is what we're working with. So on the right side, you see the psychosis, and on the left side, you see akathisia. So let me talk a little bit about what that means. Akathisia is a phenomenon that patients that are being treated with 5-HT2As or SSRIs can get, and it's a jitterousness, it's a crawling out of the skin, it's a high anxiety that can actually predispose patients to suicidality. When you combine that with a 5-HT2A, you're able to create a unique blend that blocks the psychosis and blocks the akathisia while augmenting the antidepressant effect and also creating an anti-suicidal effect. So that is the core stone of our discovery, and that is what led to an intellectual property position. So let me briefly talk about our phase 2 study. While we were running this study, the FDA had approached us and gave us input on how to do a phase 3 study. So this is a small study, and what it shows here On the axis here that you see is the MADRS depression scale. So that is the primary endpoint. And you see in the first 2 days, that is the ketamine phase. So this is where patients that were bipolar depressed, so a MADRS of 30 or more, and had acute suicidality, meaning they needed to be hospitalized, were treated with ketamine. When they responded and became not acutely suicidal anymore and their depression had gone down, they were randomized to either NRx 101 in the blue or lurasidone in the orange. So our study will be an active controlled study. And you can see that also already after just a few weeks, 2 weeks approximately, there was a separation. So that is what we will be trying to replicate in our phase 3 study. The only difference is here that the FDA asked us to separate the ketamine portion into one study and roll over the patients into the second study of NRx 101. So we're very excited about that. And we think that there's a very high unmet need. We do believe also that right now, aside from the pandemic that we have in COVID, there is also a pandemic in mental health. And so we are very eager to serve these patients. So what's the strategy behind this? Think of the following. On the left side, you see that a lot of companies are currently focusing on treatment-resistant depression. Well, we're focusing on the right side. There are very few drugs for bipolar depression, and all of the drugs that are serotonin-based actually carry a warning for increased risk of suicidality. Recall that before I told you that about half of the patients that have bipolar disorder at some point in time attempt suicide over their lifetime. So that is the population that we're currently focusing on, and no one is actually focusing on that area, bipolar depression with suicidality. Everybody else is doing either bipolar depression or major depressive disorders. And so this area in the orange is our beachhead that you see there. And this is what we're going to be developing in our clinical studies. And then in our next studies, we will seek to expand to this broader patient population. So we think that NRx 101 has a significant revenue potential, and currently there is no drug approved for bipolar depression with acute suicidal ideation and behavior. We also see potential to expand to PTSD with suicidal ideation. Right now, there's a crisis also in the area of veterans and armed service members. We lose between 17 and 22 every day to suicidality or to suicide. And so we think that our drug has a great potential to serve this great unmet need. Currently, patients with bipolar depression and acute suicidality don't have many options. And the principal option is ECT, which is not a very attractive proposition. It's very invasive and is very disruptive to the life. We think that NRx 101 actually has the potential to change the treatment paradigm by rapidly stabilizing the patient with an initial infusion of ketamine and then discharging this patient to home with an oral and non-addictive drug. The total population that has bipolar depression and acute suicidality is about 150 to 180,000. Those that are subacute, so don't need hospitalization, are about 2 to 3 times that size. Let me move to our second franchise. This is ZYESAMI for lung injuries and critical COVID-19. Let me talk a little bit about the mechanism of action for ZYESAMI. ZYESAMI is actually a synthetic form of vasoactive intestinal peptide, which is found in all mammalian species, and it actually helps with inflammation. So aviptadil is the synthetic form that we have developed and formulated, and we've spent a significant amount of time in generating a stable formulation for that. VIP is believed to upregulate surfactant production, which is what you need in order to transfer oxygen to the bloodstream through the alveoli. It does block cytokine production, and there's data also showing that it inhibits the coronavirus replication. On the bottom right, you see a picture of a patient that was actually treated in our expanded access. You see on the left side, this is before being treated. You see almost white out, and then you can see 48 hours and 10 days post, a significant improvement in those patients. Let me briefly talk about our data. So we had near statistical significance on our primary endpoint just missed it by 0.85, but we did have significance on survival alone. Now, this is going to be supported and augmented by the ongoing study that NIH is currently running. Aviptadil, as I mentioned before, has an effect on inflammatory markers. So these are two markers that I want to pay special attention to and that we're exploring, approaching the FDA in the second half of the year to discuss a potential for accelerated approval. Under accelerated approval, you can share with the FDA, with their agreement, markers and intermediate endpoints that predict or may be reasonably associated with outcomes. IL-6 is one of those there is literature showing that it actually correlates with clinical outcomes, including mortality. And you can see Aviptadil in the red has a significant impact on this marker within days after being dosed. On the right side, you see the respiratory distress ratio, also known as PaO2, FiO2. So that's a marker of how much oxygen is being transferred to your blood. And you can see that after just a few days of dosing, there's a significant separation between Aviptadil and placebo. So which is the critical ongoing trial? It is clearly the active 3B testicle study, which is sponsored by the NIH, fully funded by them. So we only provide our drug to them in its IV administration. And it's being randomized versus Aviptadil plus remdesivir, and placebo. We are in continuous contact with the NIH. And currently there are about 465 out of the 640 patients enrolled in the Aviptadil and its corresponding placebo arm. So where is ZYESAMI going to be positioned and what is the very high unmet need that we see here? So when you think of the various stages that COVID has, mild, moderate, severe, and critical, the severe and critical patients are usually in the hospital. And in particular, in the critical space, there's a big gap. There's almost nothing that works right now. Physicians tell us they use steroids. When you read the guidelines in the Infectious Disease Society of America, as well as the NIH, you see that they only recommend using remdesivir or tocilizumab in the very early stages of the critical COVID disease. So we see a very high unmet need here and an opportunity to serve these patients with ZYESAMI. So where do we think the COVID pandemic is going to go? Well, we know that about 1 million patients have died in the United States due to COVID. But we think that COVID is going to become endemic. Currently, we lose about 500 patients per day to COVID. If you think of this and the mortality is about 30%, then we're talking about 1,500 patients or so entering ICUs every day. That translates to about 200 to 300,000 patients that will be entering ICUs every year. And so we think that in addition to the 200,000 cases of general ARDS, so this is non-COVID related ARDS, there will be a significant number of COVID ARDS patients that will still require treatment as we move forward. What is our commercial path to market? So as I mentioned before, we've been working very diligently to enable commercial supply of our drug, and we're working with two commercial manufacturers, Nephron Pharmaceuticals and Alchemy. Alchemy also has a QP certification, which means that we could supply in Europe. We've signed an agreement with Cardinal Health for specialty distribution and 3PL logistics. And with IQVIA, should we get EUA, we would work with IQVIA to establish all the commercial services as well, medical, pharmacovigilance, et cetera. I mentioned before, ZYESAMI is not only a COVID drug. There are multiple other avenues that we can take this drug into, both in its IV and in its inhaled form. Sepsis ARDS, which is an area that we think is still a very high unmet need. There was a small phase 1 study done in about 2005, 2006, of which 7 of 8 patients had a benefit to it. Sarcoidosis, delay of lung transplant, checkpoint inhibitor pneumonitis. So there are multiple lung injury diseases that we can take our drug with, and we're very excited about the opportunity to pursue areas of non-COVID. So let me now hand over to Ira to cover briefly our financials.
Thank you, Robert, and good afternoon, everyone. Even though NRx Pharmaceuticals, Inc., or NRx, went public less than a year ago, the company has been around since 2015. And as Robert mentioned, the company was founded based upon NRx 101 and the potential that that drug could save lives. And that's what the company focuses on every single day, doing what we can to try to save people's lives. We're at the point now, because we pivoted to, during the pandemic, to ZYESAMI, that we have 2 phase 3 assets with potentially broader uses for each of those drugs. So turning to our financials, as of year end, which is the last information that we've released publicly, we had $27.6 million of cash. We did have a $25 million gross capital raise in February of 2022. Towards the end of March, we had 66.4 million shares outstanding, and there are potential earnouts, both shares and cash, depending upon certain milestones, if they are met by the end of this calendar year. And those are described in our public filings, our 10K. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Robert to summarize.
Yes, thank you, Ira. So in summary, we have 2 phase 3 shots on goal in areas of very high unmet need. We call them large niches. One in psychiatry with NRx 101 for bipolar depression with suicidality, and we have breakthrough therapy designation and a SPA. It is an oral and non-addictive drug, so that's a key differentiator here. We have solid intellectual property position, and our path to an NDA requires less than 150 patients. We also have a respiratory franchise, and we have a phase 3 study ongoing for critical COVID-19 by the NIH, fully funded. So all we provide is actually the drug for that. And we have a commercial path to market. In all, we expect data readouts in the next 12 to 18 months. And one thing that we have demonstrated as a leadership team, as all colleagues, and we're a company of about 20 to 25 individuals, we have a demonstrated ability to execute.
And that could lead us to, that could result in revenue potential in 2023 and 2024.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ira. Ami, with that,
thank you.
We'd love to entertain any questions.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for the presentation. Maybe start with the bipolar patients with sort of suicidality. Can you help us understand the clinical significance of the endpoint that's being measured? Exactly. And how that really helps address the subset of the patient population that you're targeting, because that is unique or different from what some of the other drugs that have been approved in the market have targeted?
Yes. So the primary indication and endpoint in our clinical study will be MADRS. So that's depression. However, these patients, in addition to having a depression score of 30 or more, will also have a Columbia Suicidality Rating Scale of 4 or 5, which means that they need to be hospitalized. So the primary endpoint will be MADRS. Secondary endpoints will be relapse and or suicidality as well. So FDA was actually very helpful in helping us construct this study design.
So why is the suicidality a secondary endpoint? Because that seems to be the primary intent of the study in a way.
Well, very, very good question. So suicidality, excellent question. Suicidality is very fleeting and it can move very quickly up or down on that. Depression tends to be more steady, but suicidality can be, momentaneous, reactive. It can go up or down within a day or two and then come back down as well. So it is a secondary endpoint, and it's therefore MADRS is an endpoint that FDA recommended for us to pursue on this one.
Got it. And typically for depression or bipolar depression, studies, I've seen larger trials. And so help us understand how you're designing this where you need only about 150 patients.
Right, very good question. So remember that NRx 101 is a fixed dose combination of D-cycloserine and lurasidone. So two drugs that are very well established and very well known. Right? And so FDA has said that they allowed us to do an active control. So the other arm is lurasidone, and they feel that they have enough data on lurasidone as well, so that all we need to do is show a significant difference in MADRS to be able to make it to a registration. And we think that with the addition of D-cycloserine, we can generate that differentiation, certainly on the MADRS score, but also on other endpoints. As I shared before, in a very small study of about 22 patients, we were already able to show a difference.
Got it. And then that is basically central to your patent estate on this, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So if the data is positive and the drug gets approved, where in the treatment paradigm do you see it being used? Obviously, there aren't a ton of treatment options right now, but if you can sort of try to elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. So as I mentioned, there's about 150 to 180,000 patients with bipolar depression and acute suicidal ideation and behavior that are hospitalized every year. So these patients are found in psychiatric inpatient units, emergency rooms, psychiatric emergency rooms, et cetera. About 150 to 180,000. Okay. So we feel that in this case, our treatment paradigm will help these patients rather than being hospitalized for a week or two and discharging and coming back in, that these patients could be initially stabilized with an infusion of ketamine and then discharged after a day or two with oral NRx 101. And maybe just to add a little bit to this, the breakthrough therapy designation that the FDA gave us was and is for the treatment of severe bipolar depression in patients with acute suicidal ideation and behavior after initial stabilization with ketamine or other effective therapy. So they could be treated with ketamine or they could be treated with other therapies as well. And this would extend the treatment that these patients have received, but allow them to go back home and be treated from home.
Got it. And that's probably why the FDA suggests that you separate those two portions of the study.
Exactly.
Okay.
So all we need to do is actually win on the second study, not on the first study.
Got it. And from a payer coverage perspective, then this would really put it under prescription coverage, not medical coverage. Is that correct?
Well, so let me tell you a little bit. So in our initial discussions with payers, they were all very excited to hear one thing. If a patient gets treated with ketamine, which is an NMDA antagonist, and then gets treated with our drug, so DCS has partially that same mechanism as well, they're highly likely to respond to our drug, right? So in essence, so if a patient doesn't respond to ketamine, they're not likely to respond to our drug. So payers really like that component of this as well. But yes, so it could be a mix of having received an initial prescription at the clinic and or then in an outpatient environment.
Mm-hmm. How does that impact a potential payer strategy?
Sorry, can you repeat? How does this impact what?
A payer strategy or sort of a coverage or pricing strategy.
Okay.
Because it sounds like at least the first dose needs to be at the hospital or
right.
inpatient.
So we have done an analysis of that, and hospitalization for patients can run anywhere from $5,000 or $6,000 for somebody that is on Medicaid to $9,000 on commercial and about $11,000 to $12,000 in Medicare. So it is a very substantial cost. And what we've also learned is that many of these patients right now, they get rehospitalized within 10 or 30 days. So it is a significant cost to them and to the hospitals. One of the highest predictors for suicide is actually recent hospitalization for suicidality as well. So payers are very aware of patients that are hospitalized for suicidality, and it's an area of high attention for them.
Got it. So from a sort of pharmacoeconomic perspective, you might be able to prevent the rehospitalization.
First of all, hopefully save lives. Second, prevent the and discharge. Well, not only the rehospitalization, but also make the hospitalization much shorter. So be able to discharge that patient maybe in a day or two versus having to stay in the hospital for a week or two. That is significantly different as well.
Robert, wouldn't we also be avoiding the cost of ECT as well as its side effects?
Yes, when some of the patients get treated on ECT, and that can be very, very costly. Remember, patients need to be fully sedated for that as well.
Understood. Okay, that's very helpful. Just moving on to the COVID program. I guess I wanted to just understand, and perhaps this is more of a 30,000-foot question. There seems to be sort of an expectation that we are in an endemic, and we are going to see a reduction, hopefully, a reduction in the cases, and with that, reduction in the critical cases as time passes. Can you maybe address maybe a two-part question? With sort of these evolving variants, does that impact the applicability of what you're developing? And perhaps talk about the market opportunity in the context of an endemic and maybe decreasing cases. Hopefully decreasing cases.
So variants are likely here to stay. ZYESAMI is not variant dependent. It's a drug to protect the lungs, irrespective of what the insult is in this particular case. So that's a key component here. Now, from an endemic phase, as I mentioned before, we believe that COVID is going to be here to stay. Right now, the data that we have in front of us tells us that the average day is about 500 patients dying. And that could go down still. Hopefully, it will continue to go down. But we think it'll be here to stay because COVID will continue to affect some people. Not everybody will get vaccinated. There are people that are immunocompromised. So we think, as I mentioned before, it'll be about 200,000 or so cases that will be in the ICU every year, which is analogous to the 200,000 cases of acute respiratory distress that we have right now, which is non-COVID dependent. So we think that there will be a background of COVID still with us for a good period of time.
And what's the applicability beyond COVID?
Yes, so we're very excited. So beyond COVID, it would be ARDS that is non-COVID dependent. So it could be due to virus, it could be due to sepsis. That's one. And then the other disease areas that we're very interested in, and there's numerous there, are, for example, sarcoidosis, as well as we're looking at checkpoint inhibitor pneumonitis, delay of transplant, a lung transplant. There's numerous other areas that we will be exploring with the IV formulation initially, but also with the inhaled formulation as well. So there's several other disease areas that we can pursue.
Got it. Okay, that's very helpful. Perhaps maybe if you could just talk about the balance sheet. You gave us a sense of where your cash balance was. Could you give us a sense of the runway and in the context of the data readouts coming up?
Sure. So we have not given guidance on our current cash position or our current cash usage. But what I point out is if you look at the 10K and if you look at our 10Qs, second and third quarter, and you do the math, and I'll do the math for people, although you can look at it yourself. In the third quarter, we used about $12 million in cash for operations. In the fourth quarter, about $11.3 million of cash in operations. So that averaged about $3.9 million a month in cash used in operations. On a going forward basis, there are going to be some puts and some takes. We were paying for the vaccine. We were paying for an inhaled study. Both of those we're winding down or we've paused. Whereas in the future, we're going to have this phase 2 study that we've just initiated on NRx 101 and the phase 3 study for NRx 101. So we haven't really given guidance on the differences, but I would point to our historical cash run rates as a valid data point to consider.
Understood. Okay. I guess with that, I have addressed all the questions I had. So I'd like to thank everybody on the team for taking the time to come in and tell the story and answer some of these questions, and to our listeners as well for participating. Thank you so much.